The last bucket of earth came up heavy, scraping the sides of the narrow shaft with a sound like a final breath. Cora's arms screamed, the muscles trembling not from the single act but from the accumulation of 1,000 such lifts. Down in the dark, the packed clay walls of her creation stood solid, smelling of deep earth and stone and a strange, clean coolness that defied the blistering August sun above. She set the bucket down, her knuckles raw and scraped, and ran a hand over the rough-hewn timbers bracing the entrance. It was done! A pit, a vault, a secret stomach hidden beneath the dusty floorboards of her barn. Her husband, gone 2 winters now, had always said the land gives and the land takes, but he never spoke of hiding a portion from the taking. That was Cora's idea, born of a silence that left too much room for fear. She remembered the looks from the other homesteaders when she'd bought the extra seed corn, the way Mr. Davies, whose property bordered hers to the east, had watched her reinforce the barn's foundation. A woman alone has no need for such surplus, Cora, he'd said, his voice thick with a pity that felt more like a warning. Best to rely on neighbors, not on schemes. He made her foresight sound like a sin, a lack of faith in the community or in God himself. But Cora had seen the hungry winter of 78, seen the gaunt faces and the rationing that wasn't enough. She knew faith didn't fill a belly. Hard work and a plan did. She dragged the heavy trapdoor, a double layer of thick planks, over the opening. It fit with a dull thud, the join she'd spent a week perfecting seating almost seamlessly. She scattered loose hay and dirt over it, kicking it with the toe of her worn boot until it looked like nothing more than the rest of the barn floor, forgotten and unremarkable. For a moment, she felt a sliver of panic. What if she couldn't open it again? What if she had buried her own hope? But then she felt the solidness of the ground beneath her feet, the immense, secret weight of the space she had carved out by hand, and the panic subsided. It was replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty. Let them have their faith in neighbors. She would have her faith in this. In the cool, dark, silent earth. The idea hadn't struck her like lightning. It had grown slowly, a stubborn root in the soil of her grief. After Martin died, the silence in their small cabin was a physical presence. The nights were the worst, filled with the sounds of the prairie, the cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of unseen things in the tall grass, sounds that had once been a comfort but now only underscored her solitude. She'd lie awake and listen, and in the listening, she began to hear the land's own rhythms. She heard the desperation in the wind during a dry spell and the false promise in a sky that gathered clouds but gave no rain. Martin had been a man of observation, not of words. He taught her to read the signs, the way the locusts pulsed in the heat, the color of the corn silk, the depth of the cracks in the dry creek bed. The land remembers every debt, he'd murmured once, looking out at a field that had given them a bounty 1 year and dust the next. That memory, his words, became her inheritance. The first real seed of the plan was planted by the memory of her grandmother, a woman from the old country who spoke of root cellars so deep and cold they could keep a potato crisp for a year. They didn't have hills to dig into here, only the vast, flat expanse of the plains. But they had depth. The soil was rich on top, but went down to a hard, dense clay that held its shape. She started small, telling herself she was just digging a new privy pit, a plausible chore for a lone woman. But the hole kept going down, deeper than any privy needed to be. Each night, after the sun had bled from the sky, she would light a single lantern in the barn, its glow hidden from the road, and she would dig. The work was a kind of prayer, a meditation in sweat and muscle. The blisters on her hands bloomed, broke, and hardened into calluses. She was not digging a grave for her sorrow, but a future free from the whims of the sky. The engineering of it was a slow, brutal education in physics and geology, taught by the earth itself. The topsoil was easy, but then she hit the clay, a thick, stubborn layer that had to be chipped away in chunks with a pickaxe she'd traded 3 good hens for. The problem was not just digging down, but getting the earth out. She devised a simple pulley system with a length of old rope and a bucket, hauling it up hand over hand, her body a counterweight. She dumped the clay in the dry creek bed behind her property, a cartload at a time, under the cover of darkness, smoothing it over so it looked like natural erosion. She was a ghost, erasing her own tracks. The walls were her biggest worry. A simple pit would collapse. She'd seen it happen at the well. She needed support. She used the thickest planks from an old shed Martin had planned to tear down, bracing them against the clay walls as she went deeper. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. She tested every board, putting her full weight against it, feeling for the slightest give. The space she hollowed out was not large, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet square, a rough-hewn cube of darkness. The real challenge was moisture. A damp silo would mean rot, and rot would mean her entire effort was for nothing. For weeks, she was stumped. The clay was mostly dry, but after a rare rain, she could feel a clammy dampness seeping through. A dry well was one thing, a dry storage pit was another matter entirely. She thought about lining it with tar, but the cost was too high and the smell would taint the grain. She tried packing the walls with dry straw, but it just seemed to hold the dampness close. She was near despair, sitting at the edge of the pit one evening, the scale of her possible failure pressing down on her. The earth was a patient teacher, but a cruel one. Failure was not a lesson, it was a sentence. She was failing, and the thought of another hungry winter, of relying on the thin charity of men like Davies, was a cold knot in her stomach. The answer came not from the earth, but from a man who smelled of dust and distance. Finn was a trader, a man whose face was a map of roads and long suns. He passed through twice a year, his packhorse laden with needles, salt, and news from other, far-flung places. He stopped at Cora's cabin for water, as he always had. He never stayed long and asked few questions. This time, however, he noticed the state of her hands, the clay packed deep under her nails. He glanced towards the barn, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. Cora stiffened, expecting a question she couldn't answer. Instead, he just nodded slowly. He accepted the water she offered and a piece of hardtack. While his horse drank, he rummaged in one of his bags and pulled out a small, lumpy sack. "Slaked lime," he said, his voice raspy. "My grandfather used it to line his spring house. Keeps the damp out. Keeps the vermin from burrowing through, too. A thin layer, plastered right on the walls, dries hard as stone." He held the sack out to her. She hesitated. "What do you want for it?" she asked, her voice tight. Charity was a debt she couldn't afford. Finn looked at the worn sleeve of his jacket, where a seam had come undone. "A bit of thread and a steady hand," he said. "And maybe one more cup of that water." It was a fair trade, knowledge for a small service. While she meticulously stitched his jacket, he explained the process. Mix the lime with water to make a paste, spread it on the walls, and let it cure. It would draw the moisture from the clay and form a breathable, protective barrier. He didn't ask what she was building. He didn't need to. In his world, people did what they had to do to survive, and secrets were a form of currency best left unspent. When he rode out an hour later, the sack of lime felt heavier than a bag of gold in Cora's hands. It was the missing piece, the key. That night, she didn't dig. She mixed and plastered, her hands covered in the white paste, smoothing it over the clay walls by lantern light. The silo was no longer just a hole, it was becoming a vessel. With the walls sealed and dry, the rest of the work felt like a victory lap. She laid a floor of flat stone she'd hauled from the creek bed, fitting them together like a puzzle. Over that, she put down a layer of thick, dry planks. She built a small set of sturdy ladder rungs into one wall, testing each one twice. The final harvest came, and it was a good one. The sun and the rain had come at the right times, a rare gift. While her neighbors celebrated, filling their barn lofts and sheds with sheaves of corn and sacks of wheat, Cora worked in secret. Each night, she threshed a portion of her grain inside the barn, the sound muffled by the thick walls. Then, sack by heavy sack, she carried it to the trap door and lowered it into the darkness. The first sacks landing on the stone floor made a sound that was utterly final, a promise kept. She didn't fill the silo completely. She kept a plausible amount in the barn itself, enough to deflect suspicion, enough to show anyone who might come asking that she had a modest, widow's portion put by for the winter. The rest went into the earth. When she was done, the silo was 3/4 full, a hidden reserve of life and warmth. She climbed out for the last time, her legs aching, and pulled the heavy door into place. She scattered the hay, brushed the dirt over the seams, and placed an old, broken plowshare on top, as if it had been discarded there months ago. It was invisible. Her secret was safe, buried. Standing there in the dusty quiet of her barn, she felt a profound sense of peace. It was different from the relief of a good harvest. This was a deeper thing, a feeling of sovereignty. She had not bent the world to her will, but she had carved out a small piece of it that would not be subject to the whims of weather or the thinness of pity. The land could take its share from the fields, but it could not touch what was in the earth. Let the winter come. Let the dry winds blow. She was ready. The summer that followed began with a deceptive mildness, a soft spring that promised abundance. The corn grew tall and green, the wheat heads filled out, and a feeling of comfortable optimism settled over the small community. Mr. Davies even stopped her on the road one Sunday, a rare smile cracking his stern face. "A fine year, Cora," he'd said, a statement that felt like both a blessing and a dismissal. "The Lord provides for us all." Cora had only nodded, her own fields looking just as prosperous as his. But she felt a prickle of unease. The heat arrived in July, not with the usual steady warmth, but with a suffocating, brassy glare. The sky turned a pale, hazy white. The rain stopped. The land grew thirsty, the soil cracking into a fine, grey powder. The corn leaves began to curl at the edges, a sign of deep distress. The optimism of spring curdled into a low, anxious hum. Then came the sound. At first, it was just a whisper on the wind, a distant, rhythmic clicking, almost like a strange cicada. But it grew steadily louder, day by day, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a dry, chittering hum that vibrated in the bones. People would stop their work in the fields, shading their eyes to look at the horizon. There was nothing to see, but the sound was there, a promise of something terrible. Cora heard it too. She felt it. She spent her days in a quiet flurry of activity, checking the seal on the silo's trapdoor, packing the cracks with extra rags and tar. She brought all her remaining chickens into the barn, securing them in their coop. She drew extra water from the well, filling every bucket and barrel she owned. She wasn't panicking. She was preparing. The sound was the teeth of the world, getting ready to bite. She remembered Martin's stories of the great swarms that had come when he was a boy, swarms that blotted out the sun and left the world barren. They were the stuff of legend, a biblical plague made real. And now, the legend was coming for them. It arrived not as a cloud, but as a stain on the western sky, a smudge of dirty brown that grew and spread with unnatural speed. The humming intensified, becoming a roar, a million tiny engines all screaming at once. The air grew thick and still. The birds fell silent. Then the first wave hit. They weren't like grasshoppers, they were bigger, heavier, armored things that flew with a clumsy, voracious purpose. They descended on the fields, and the world dissolved into a frenzy of eating. The green corn vanished. The golden wheat disappeared. The leaves were stripped from the trees, the vegetable gardens devoured down to the bare stalks. It was not a harvest, it was an erasure. The sky darkened as the full swarm passed over, a living eclipse that cast a sickly yellow light on the ravaged land. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure on the eardrums. Cora stood inside her cabin, the door barred, a wet cloth stuffed into the crack at the bottom. She watched through a small window as the locusts covered everything, a writhing, clicking carpet of hunger. They clung to the walls of the cabin, their alien faces pressed against the glass. The sound was inside with her, the sound of the world being unmade. For 2 days, they stayed. The sun was a pale disk in a sky of wings. The second night was the worst. The feeding had slowed, but the sheer weight of their presence, the relentless, mindless motion, was a kind of madness. On the morning of the third day, a wind picked up from the east. As if obeying a signal, the swarm rose into the air, a chaotic, swirling mass, and moved on, leaving behind a profound and shattered silence. When Cora finally unbarred her door and stepped outside, the devastation was absolute. The land was stripped bare, chewed down to the dirt. The fields were gone. The trees were skeletons. The only color left was the brown of the earth and the gray of the sky. Her neighbors stumbled from their homes, their faces masks of disbelief and horror. Mr. Davies stood in the middle of his ruined cornfield, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Everything they had worked for, everything they had counted on, was gone. Weeks turned into a month. The initial shock gave way to a slow, grinding despair. The community stores, what little they had in their barns and cellars from the previous year, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. There would be no harvest to replenish them. There was nothing. The land itself looked wounded, unwilling to grow even weeds. The locusts had not just eaten the crops, they had eaten the future. A quiet, desperate hunger began to settle over the homesteads. People grew thinner, their eyes larger, their movements slower. The easy greetings on the road were replaced by curt nods and averted gazes. Every family was an island of want, hoarding what little they had left. Cora remained isolated, but for a different reason. She rationed her own supplies carefully, eating from her small garden, which she had managed to partly cover with old blankets, and from the stores she had kept above ground. She did not touch the silo. Not yet. It was her final defense, her guarantee against the absolute worst. But she saw the hunger in the faces of others. She saw the way Mrs. Davies's hands trembled when she came to trade a lace collar for a few eggs. She heard the hushed, frightened conversations when she made her rare trips to the small settlement for salt. The talk was of leaving, of abandoning the homesteads entirely, but there was nowhere to go. Every settlement for 100 miles had been hit. The disaster was not local, it was regional. The breaking point came in the form of a young man named Samuel, who worked as a hand for the Davies family. He appeared at her door one evening, his face pale and drawn. He didn't ask for a handout. He offered to work, to chop wood, to mend her fence, to do anything for a sack of flour. "Mr. Davies is proud," Samuel stammered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "He won't ask." But his wife, she ain't eaten a full meal in a week. They're grinding seed corn to make meal. The stuff meant for spring planting. The image was stark, a man so proud he would eat his own future to avoid asking for help. Cora looked at the young man's earnest, desperate face, and she knew the time for secrets was over. Her carefully guarded solitude, her fortress of self-reliance, was about to be breached. She made her decision not with a surge of charity, but with the cold, clear logic of a survivor. A community of graves would do her no good. A dead neighbor is not a neighbor at all, just a reminder of what's to come. If they all starved, her silo would just be a well-stocked tomb. Survival was not a solitary endeavor, not in the long run. "Wait here," she told Samuel. She walked to the barn, the young man watching her with a mixture of hope and confusion. Inside, she moved the broken plowshare, scraped away the dirt and hay, and lifted the heavy trapdoor. The air that rose from the opening was cool and smelled faintly of dry grain and earth, the scent of life itself. When Samuel saw the top of the ladder descending into the lamplit darkness, and the vast, golden mound of grain below, his jaw fell open. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The sheer, impossible fact of it was enough. Cora descended the ladder, filled a large sack with wheat, and hauled it back up. It was heavy, but it felt right in her arms. She handed it to Samuel. "This is not a gift," she said, her voice steady and firm, leaving no room for argument. "It is a loan. It will be accounted for. Tell Mr. Davies I will be holding a meeting tomorrow at sunrise. In my barn. Everyone is to come. Anyone who wants to eat this winter will be there." Samuel, still speechless, could only nod. He hefted the sack, the weight of it a miracle, and practically ran back toward the Davies homestead. Cora watched him go, then slowly closed the trapdoor, her mind already working. She was no longer just a widow with a secret. She was now the keeper of the future, a role she had never asked for but which she would not shirk. The rules would have to be strict. The rationing would have to be fair and absolute. There would be no room for pride, or old slights, or special treatment. Winter was coming, and food was now a weapon against it. She would wield it carefully, but she would wield it. The next morning, they came. They gathered in her barn, a silent, grim-faced assembly of her neighbors, their faces etched with a mixture of shame, suspicion, and a desperate, fragile hope. Mr. Davies stood at the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Cora stood before them, not behind a pulpit, but on the same dusty floor, beside the faint outline of the trap-door. She let the silence stretch, letting them absorb the reality of where they were, in her barn, on her terms. "There is enough," she began, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet space. "There is enough for all of us to survive the winter, if we are careful. But there will be no charities." A murmur went through the small crowd. "This is a community bank," she continued, her gaze meeting Mr. Davies's directly. "And I am the banker. Each family will receive a weekly ration, based on the number of mouths to feed. Every sack will be weighed and recorded in a ledger. Come spring, when relief arrives or when we can plant again, the loans will be repaid. In seed, in labor, in livestock. We will all start the next year even." She laid out the rules. There would be one distribution day a week. No exceptions. She would do the measuring herself. The grain was for food, not for feeding livestock that could be butchered, not for foolish ventures. It was for human survival. A man from the back spoke up. "Why should you be the one to decide?" Cora's answer was simple and brutal. "Because I am the one who dug the hole." There was no arguing with that logic. The proof of her foresight was beneath their feet. Mr. Davies, the man who had called her plans schemes, finally spoke. "The terms are fair," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. It was enough. And so, the long winter began. Every week, they lined up at her barn, and every week, Cora descended into her silo and brought up their survival. She was stern, methodical, and impeccably fair. She recorded every transaction in her ledger, the debits and credits of their collective life. She became the center of the community, not through warmth or friendship, but through a competence that was as solid and reliable as the earth itself. The silo, her secret hoard, had become their salvation. Her rejection, her isolation, had been the crucible that forged the tool of their survival. She had planned for herself, but in doing so, she had provided for them all. It was a quiet, moral victory, one that needed no parades or speeches. The proof was in the faces of her neighbors, slowly losing the gaunt look of hunger, and in the steady, rhythmic scratch of her pen in the ledger, marking down the debts that they would all, together, repay to the future.